Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov was born on March 18, 1844, in the town of Tikhvin, some 100 miles east of St. Petersburg and northeast of Veliki Novgorod. He grew up in the country estate of his family, a noble family with a long history of military and naval service. As a boy, young Rimsky dreamed of becoming a sailor. So, at the age of 12, he left home to join the Navy, studying at the School for Mathematical and Navigational Sciences. Upon graduating at the age of 18, he served at sea for 3 years, from 1862 to 65, cruising around the world, visiting cities like London, New York, and Rio de Janeiro. Prior to this journey, Rimsky-Korsakov was introduced to Mili Balakirev, a charismatic 25-year-old self-taught composer who rejected the conservatory and sought to create a distinctly Russian school of music. Balakirev encouraged Rimsky-Korsakov to compose his first symphony, despite his lack of formal training. Upon returning to St. Petersburg in 1865, Rimsky-Korsakov revised his first symphony, Opus 1, which was premiered that December. Rimsky begins to traverse between two worlds, a naval officer who entertained friends with his piano playing, a composer who wore a military uniform to rehearsals. Balakirev was a nationalist in music and in politics. He was a participant in the Pan-Slavic movement that sought to unite the Slavic peoples and cultures of the Balkans, Bohemia, and Russia. In 1866, he asked Rimsky-Korsakov to compose a fantasia on Serbian themes, which was performed the next year in honor of the delegates to the Second Pan-Slavic Congress in Moscow. Also performed at this concert were works by Balakirev himself and those of his close associates, the composer amateurs César Cui, Modest Mussorgsky, and Alexander Borodin. In a review of this concert, the music critic and Balakirev associate Vladimir Stasov referred to the five as Moguchaya Kuchka, the mighty handful. In 1861, Vladimir Stasov had written a scenario based on the tale of Sadko, a Russian medieval epic, or Bylina. According to the legend, Sadko was a merchant and a musician who played the gusli, a plucked string instrument similar to the zither. On one of his voyages, Sadko angered the king of the sea for failing to pay proper respects, and descended into the sea as sacrifice. In the Sea Kingdom, Sadko's gusli playing won the favor of the king, who promised his daughter's hand in marriage to Sadko. Through divine intervention, the strings of Sadko's gusli breaks, and suddenly he is returned to the earth. A well-known and culturally significant fairy tale, Sadko was a popular subject among nationalist artists at this time, who sought after themes based on Russian folk stories and folk art. Stasov originally offered his scenario to Balakirev, who passed it on to Mussorgsky. Both men were busy pursuing other projects, so in 1867, the story was passed on to Rimsky-Korsakov. He quickly composed the 11-minute piece, often cited as the very first Russian tone poem, a symphonic narrative that tells the story through music only, without the use of actors or singers. Sadko became Rimsky-Korsakov's first major success, solidifying his reputation as a master of orchestration. The exact scenario devised by Stasov was never published, but Rimsky-Korsakov himself provided a fairly detailed summary of the tone poem's structure. The introduction, in the composer's words, paints a picture of the calmly surging sea. In the score, this is represented by a three-note undulating motif, highlighted in blue. The motif consists of a major third interval, D-flat to F, which along with the tonic and the bass, firmly establishes the key of D-flat major. The motif is however complicated by a minor second or semitone interval between D-flat and C, which, as we'll see later, allows the music to readily pivot towards chromaticism. The motif is first heard in the viola and then taken up by the violins, albeit inverted and sped up, in eighth notes as opposed to the quarter notes in the viola. In this video, I highlight variations of the same motif using different shades of the same color. As we'll see, especially in the third movement, two-part and three-part counterpoints of related themes, often created from the same basic motif, feature prominently in this work. According to Rimsky-Korsakov, the harmonic modulations that we just heard, minor third descends from the home key of D-flat to B-flat, then to G, were inspired by Liszt. Specifically, the opening of Ce qu'on entend sur la montagne, also known as Mountain Symphony, inspired by Victor Hugo's poem of the same name. Indeed, from measures 40 to 67 in Liszt's work, we see this exact modulatory pattern, with the harmony descending from E-flat to C to A, and then to F sharp. Minor third progressions are closely related to the octatonic scale, which is an 8-note scale consisting of successive semitone and whole tone intervals. For instance, taking the D-flat, B-flat, G progression in Sadko, we can complete the progression by descending by another minor third to E, which then brings us back to D-flat. Lining up all the notes in these 4 triads, we obtain the following octatonic collection. If this sonority sounds familiar, it's because we have heard it already twice in this video. First, in rehearsal 1 of Sadko, following the minor third modulations, we hear prominently the dark blue semitone motif, a fragment of the 3-note C motif. The semitone interval highlights the octatonic sonority. We can trace from E flat in the bass up a semitone to F flat, a whole tone up to F sharp, a semitone up to G, a whole tone up to A, and so on and so forth. 2 bars later, we hear a different octatonic collection. Starting again from the bass note, this time A flat, we can go up a semitone to B double flat, up a whole tone to B natural, up a semitone to C, up a whole tone to D natural, and so on. We had also heard the octatonic scale in the Liszt. The diatonic melody was transformed into octatonic when the harmony descends from E flat to C. Another notable chromatic feature in this section of Sadko is the harmonic progression from B flat major to G flat minor, which are hexatonic poles. The hexatonic scale is closely related to the octatonic scale. It can be formed through progressions of major thirds as opposed to minor thirds. It consists of 6 notes of successive semitone and minor third intervals. The B flat major to G flat minor triads, for instance, belong to the following hexatonic collection. They are called hexatonic poles because they're harmonically distant. They're part of the same hexatonic collection and yet shares no common notes. It is also notable that by simply flattening the major third interval in the C motif to a minor third, a world of hexatonic and octatonic colors are unleashed. In 1898, 32 years after the premiere of Sadko, Rimsky-Korsakov composed a full-length opera based on the same Bylina. There is a close kinship between Sadko the opera and Sadko the tone poem. For instance, all major motifs used in the tone poem, those color-coded and highlighted in this video, are reused in the opera, often serving the same narrative purpose. For example, at the conclusion of Scene 5 of the opera, as Sadko prepares to descend into the sea, he sings the following music. Similarly, in the tone poem, as the introductory movement ends, we hear the same music, the melody taken up by the clarinet. Notably, the music is octatonic. The bassoon accompaniment, for instance, straightforwardly plays descending semitone whole tone intervals. Throughout this video, I'll use different shades of teal to represent octatonicism. It is not a coincidence that Sadko's descent into the sea is portrayed through chromaticism. Rimsky-Korsakov in his autobiography explicitly calls out the influence from Glinka's Ruslan and Lyudmila. In Glinka's opera, Lyudmila's abduction by the wizard Chernomor is depicted by a descending whole tone scale. In Sadko, the protagonist's entry into the fantastical at the beginning of the second movement is depicted using a descending octatonic scale, highlighted here in teal. The use of octatonicism to represent or refer to the fantastical is a common technique used by Rimsky-Korsakov, especially in his fairy tale operas. We've already seen their inspirations from Liszt and Glinka. It similarly inspired many of Rimsky-Korsakov's contemporaries and students. Most famously, the Petrushka chord from Stravinsky's eponymous Ballet consists of two chords, C major and F sharp major, that belong to the same octatonic collection. Even after his so-called Russian period, in the neoclassical opera The Rake's Progress, the association between octatonicism and the otherworldly remains. In the so-called pantomime episode, the protagonist sleeps while the devil concocts a, quote, fantastic Baroque machine that turns stone into bread. The accompanying music forms an incomplete octatonic collection, with one missing note, C sharp. Sleep. Following the octatonic descent into the sea, the remainder of the second movement depicts a feast in the Sea Kingdom. Rimsky-Korsakov does not specify why a feast is taking place. The synopsis accompanying the second and third editions of the score, the authorship for which is not known, explains that this is a wedding between the Sea King's daughter and the ocean. In the opera, the wedding is instead between Sadko and the Sea King's daughter, Princess Volkova, who have fallen in love earlier in the opera. Regardless of who the lovers are, the expressive song-like motifs introduced in the second movement clearly suggests the theme of love. First, we hear the purple and violet themes, which sound like call and responses between lovers. In the opera, Sadko sings the purple theme, while his lover Volkova responds in the violet theme. Then we hear two sprightly themes, colored in red and pink. In the opera, they represent sea creatures that attend the wedding. In the tone poem, they can be plausibly interpreted as portrayals of the guests to the feast. Finally, an orange theme is heard, perhaps the most sweeping and romantic motif in the entire tone poem. The music is not strictly octatonic, but consists of alternating semitone and whole tone intervals. In my interpretation, it thus represents an otherworldly love. In the opera, it is in fact the Princess Volkova's love theme. Speaking on the theme of love, in the months following Sadko's premiere, the five met weekly at the home of Alexander Dargomitsky, along with other musicians. Among the frequent guests at the soirees were the sisters Alexandra and Nadezhda Pergod, a singer and pianist, respectively. A transcription of Sadko for two pianos was arranged by Nadezhda and played at one of these gatherings. 3 years later, Rimsky-Korsakov proposed to Nadezhda, and the two were married the next year, with Mussorgsky as the best man. Now listen to the entirety of the second movement of the tone poem following the descent music, as these motifs were played in succession. In his autobiography, Rimsky-Korsakov expressed a degree of dissatisfaction with the second movement, specifically that it is too long compared to the first and third movements. I tend to agree with this assessment, especially given that the different motifs are repeated one after another, but with little development or variation. In contrast, the third movement contains a wealth of thematic variations in contrapuntal writing, and is arguably the most developed and complex section of the tone poem. The movement begins with a harp, then joined by pizzicato strings, imitating the strumming of Sadko's gusli. Then, the two primary motifs of this movement, the green dance theme and the yellow cantabile theme that Rimsky-Korsakov alluded to, are introduced. In the opera, these two motifs are sung diegetically by Sadko. In the tone poem, they clearly serve the same purpose. Sadko plays while the guests dance. After the two themes are introduced, we hear their variations and interactions with other motifs. For example, we had already heard this light green variation, The first bar is identical to the original darker green theme, except the second note is no longer ornamented, while the second bar descends from E flat to B flat as opposed to ascending to F, though the same melodic contour is preserved. The variations of the dance may be interpreted as Sadko demonstrating his musical virtuosity, or alternatively the C musicians echoing Sadko's playing. We'll hear motifs from the prior section, including the orange theme associated with the Princess Volkova and the red and pink themes associated with the sea creatures. This may be interpreted as the different guests joining in to the dance. The call and response structure between Volkova's orange theme and Sadko's cantabile theme is reminiscent of the purple and violet love themes heard before. The music thus anticipates the romance between Sadko and Volkova in the opera, even though this is not spelled out directly in the program of the tone poem. The orange theme is next heard again in a duet with Sadko's green dance theme. The first half of the third movement ends with the descending octatonic motif. In the opera, this motif is associated not only with Sadko's descent, but also with the sea king himself, whose melodies almost always consist of simple descending and ascending octatonic scales. In the second half of this movement, the themes and variations swell to ever greater intensity and complexity until Sadko's gusli suddenly breaks. Note here that the dark green theme is simply the original theme played twice as slow, a textbook contrapuntal technique called augmentation. Not bad for a composer with no formal training. Recall in the earlier clip, both the descending octatonic scale and the ascending octatonic scale, here in dark teal, are associated with the seeking. The juxtaposition of these themes with the green dance theme suggests that the seeking himself has now joined into the dance. In these transitional sections, we could clearly hear octatonic colors through whole tone and semitone intervals, for instance here in the violins. The third movement of Sadko won particular critical acclaim, especially for the folk-like but original dance motif and cantabile motif, solidifying the Five's reputation as quote-unquote nationalist composers. The closing movement of Sadko is brief and almost identical to the latter half of the opening of the introductory movement, with one key difference. The purple and violet call and response themes are heard in fragments, like fractured memories. This may be interpreted as Sadko's reminiscence of his adventure. The purple theme, associated in the opera with Sadko, is heard 3 times, as if he is calling out to the sea. After a pause, the violet theme, associated in the opera with Volkova, finally responds, answering the lover's call. The parallels between Rimsky-Korsakov and Sadko, not only the character but also the narrative and the music of the tone poem, are striking. Both Rimsky-Korsakov and Sadko are sailors and musicians. Both straddle between 2 worlds, Sadko between the physical and the fantastical, and the 23-year-old composer between his professional life as a naval officer and his amateur status as a musician. The music of Sadko, with its shifts between diatonic and chromatic sounds, reflects Rimsky-Korsakov's uncertain status as a composer. He is consciously aware of his lack of formal training and equally aware of the sometimes oppressive influence of his nationalist mentors Balakirev and Stasov. Rimsky-Korsakov ends this chapter of his autobiography with a reflection on self-discovery. He acknowledges the influences of Balakirev and Liszt, but also discusses his growing musical self. The composition, performance, and success of Sadko thus mark a critical juncture in Rimsky-Korsakov's life, the beginning of his maturation as a professional composer, and, in his personal life, the budding love for his future wife. To conclude, here is the full performance of Sadko by the USSR Symphony Orchestra conducted by Evgeny Svetlanov.